Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Garrett Marquis, the spokesman for the NSC. We had a couple of productive days here in Israel. Ambassador Bolton met with the Prime Minister, of course. Then he had a bilateral with his Russian counterpart, and then the trilateral today with both Russia and Israel. This conversation, of course, is on the record. The format will be the ambassador will make a few remarks. We'll then open it up to Q&A. I think we have 4 or 5 questions that we'll run through. Val will help facilitate who asks the questions and hand over the microphone. So with that, Ambassador Bolton.
Thanks very much, Garrett. Thanks to all of you for being here. The main purpose of the visit was to have a trilateral meeting of the National Security Advisors of Israel, Russia, and the United States. This was put together at the invitation of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government of Israel to talk about issues that we were all concerned about in the Middle East. As the Prime Minister said earlier, this was the first time there's ever been a trilateral meeting of national security advisors like that. So we wanted to thank Prime Minister Netanyahu for his leadership in this area. We didn't come with the expectation we were going to solve all of the problems or even most of them, but the point of these discussions, which I do quite regularly with national security advisors in other governments, is to help cut through some of the fog that occasionally surrounds these issues and deal at a strategic level with them, which I think we accomplished today. I think these discussions were productive. We had bilateral discussions with Israel, separately bilateral discussions with Nikolai Patrushev, the Russian Secretary of their National Security Council, and then the trilateral meeting today. Plus, the Prime Minister took us to several stops in the Jordan Valley yesterday to look at the security aspects of those from Israel's perspective, which was very helpful as well. So with that, I'd be happy to answer a few questions.
First question to Wall Street Journal, Doug Lieber.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Ambassador Bolton, could you tell us what Russia is asking for in exchange for help with Iran? For example, you spoke yesterday with Mr. Patrushev about the Ukrainian conflict. Perhaps the U.S. is willing to recognize Crimea as part of Russia, or perhaps to recognize Assad as the legitimate ruler of Syria.
Well, you know, Russia, of course, is one of the 5 legitimate nuclear weapon states under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So we think Russia should have an interest, a concern, essentially equivalent to ours against the threat of nuclear proliferation. And in the case of Iran, although Russia was one of the countries that signed the nuclear deal, we see continuing evidence, growing evidence of Iran's violations of not just the nuclear deal, but the non-proliferation treaty itself. The IAEA has already found Iran to be in violation of the nuclear deal because of its exceeding the limits on sophisticated centrifuges, the device used to enrich uranium. Iran itself has threatened to blow through some of the key limits in the nuclear deal, the limits on stored reactor-grade enriched uranium, heavy water storage, and enrichment above reactor-grade levels of the U-235 isotope. Well, all of this means that the threat of a nuclear Iran is very real, as are the threats of Iran's support for terrorism, its ballistic missile program, and its other malign activities in the Middle East. So from that perspective, we talk to the Russians each time we meet about Iran as an issue, and we're going to continue to do it as long as the Iranian threat remains.
Next question goes to Tal Schneider at Globes.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My question is that your counterpart, Mr. Patrushev, mentioned that the Syrian has the right to allow foreign forces into their country. So how does that correlate with the U.S. interests in curtailing the Iran influence in the region and That was the point of the gathering today. Did you achieve your goals deterring the foreign forces inside Syria who are obviously threatening Israel?
Well, Syria was one of the subjects we discussed today. And the United States would very much like to get rid of foreign forces from Syria. We have no burning, long-time desire to stay there, I can tell you that. The real issue is the Iranian forces. They are a problem in Iraq, they are a problem in Syria, they're a problem in Lebanon, they're a problem in Yemen, they're a problem in Afghanistan. And I include in that surrogates for Iran and the Quds Force, Shia militia groups, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups. That's why these activities by Iran are so threatening. And obviously, their presence in Syria is of particular concern to Israel because of the common border and because of Israel being within range of Iranian missile capabilities that they've been trying to bring into Syria and more recently bring into Iraq. So I think that as you look at a particular problem like Syria, you have to look at the big picture as to what Iran is trying to achieve and formulate a strategy to prevent them from doing that, leading to the return of their forces and their surrogates to their respective homelands. And I think we had a broad discussion of that, and as I say, in sort of a first meeting like that, I think that really helps everybody understand what the various positions are, and we'll go from there.
Next question, Amichai Stein, Khan.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you. Was there any fear that Iran might try to interfere with the Bahrain workshop, for example, maybe attacks against oil tankers in the region during the workshop in Bahrain?
Look, Iran has engaged over the past couple months in a long series of unprovoked and unjustifiable attacks on oil tankers, oil pipelines, shooting down an American drone, and engaging in a whole range of other activity that's unacceptable. In that kind of environment, threatening the conference in Bahrain is always a possibility. They're close geographic proximity. It would be a big mistake for Iran to continue this kind of behavior. So we hope the conference, which extends over several days, will proceed unimpeded, and that would be best from even Iran's own point of view.
Oren Lieberman, CNN.
Ambassador, Iran has said that they won't come to the table unless there is sanctions relief. If the U.S. is serious about a diplomatic solution and talks, why not temporarily give sanctions relief to start that process going?
Well, if Iran were serious about a solution, it wouldn't be violating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It wouldn't be the world's central banker of international terrorism. It wouldn't have its forces engaged in combat in other sovereign countries. And it would be a very different place. That's why we put the sanctions in place, because of the unacceptable behavior that Iran is engaged in. Now, they'll either get the point, or as the President said, I think very cogently yesterday morning in imposing sanctions on the Supreme Leader, we will simply enhance the maximum pressure campaign further. It will be, I think, the combination of sanctions and other pressure that does bring Iran to the table. Their word isn't very good. They violated, as I mentioned before, the nuclear deal. They violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So their say-so is going to require being backed up, and their say-so that they'll engage in serious negotiations if we give them relief lacks a certain amount of credibility.
BBC next.
Hi there. So, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The Iranian Foreign Minister has described you and the Israeli Prime Minister as being on the B team, saying that you're calling for war and not diplomacy. Is that true?
Oh, really? I mean, look, this is sort of juvenile behavior, and it would be a waste of oxygen to comment on it further.
I'll take Yoni Kopinski or Sheva.
Hi, thank you very much, Ambassador. How do you relate to the latest statements from Washington regarding we wanted to attack, we decided not to attack? How much points on the big picture do you think that America lost in that move, or not at all?
Well, I think the president has spoken very clearly as to his thinking on the matter. I elaborated, as did Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo, in statements we've made over the weekend. I made one here in Jerusalem on Sunday when I was with the Prime Minister. Vice President Pence, I think, has spoken on a couple of the Sunday talk shows, and Secretary Pompeo issued a statement, or answered press questions on the tarmac before he left Washington, that this was an exercise of restraint and discretion by the United States, and Iran should not mistake it for weakness. I don't really have anything to add to that, although I'd be happy to repeat it again. They should not mistake it as a sign of weakness.
I'll take Jordana Miller, I-24.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you for holding this press conference. The Bahrain conference is set to open tonight. What do you believe can be accomplished there while the Palestinians are boycotting and the Israelis essentially haven't been invited?
Well, I think it's a mistake for the Palestinians to boycott it. And I think what makes this particular proposal, which is sort of being rolled out in pieces and slowly due to a lot of exigent circumstances, the thing that makes it unique is the economic aspect of it. To say, look, the prospects for Palestinians, for Israelis, for everybody in the region, if we could find an acceptable agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, is incredibly bright. And rather than relitigate decades of disputes, think about the future and negotiate on that basis. So we'll see how it goes. I think we're optimistic. I think the president's optimistic. And I hope the Palestinians are optimistic too.
Chris Mitchell, CBN.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. What's your message to Iran if in a few days they exceed the amount of allowable enriched uranium, and is a military option still on the table?
Well, I think the president would say that all options remain on the table. I wouldn't give Iran advice on what they ought to do. They should give up their pursuit of deliverable nuclear weapons. They should make that strategic decision. They haven't done it yet. All these subsidiary steps that they take simply make it more difficult for the rest of the world to trust them. I think the next step, if indeed they do blow through the limits, as they have threatened, they called it an ultimatum to the Europeans when they issued their statement. We've been in conversation with the Europeans and others about that, and I think as we understand it from European foreign ministries, their view would be that it would be a very serious mistake for Iran to ignore those limits. So we're in conversation. We'll see what the Iranians do. It would not be in their interest to do it, but they've done a lot of things recently that are not in their interest.
Ivan, Bloomberg.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton. What kind of role does the U.S. see for Bashar al-Assad in the future in Syria, and what would it take for America to support post-war reconstruction in Syria?
Look, there has been now for several years a UN process designed to create a constitutional convention, in effect, that would provide for future political arrangements in Syria, decided by Syrians, not by fiat from Assad or anybody else. We think that remembering that the conflict originated in the Arab Spring, back when people were optimistic about the prospect for self-government in the Arab world, that there's a chance that remains in Syria if we can carry that process through. We've spoken about that over the past couple days in these conversations, and that political solution remains our priority.
Jerusalem Post.
Yes, hi, Ambassador. Two questions. The first is, did you get any sense of hope from the talks with the Russians that they could in the future agree to Iran leaving Syria? And with regard to the Jordan Valley, where you spoke about the importance of security, would you recommend to President Trump that Israel should apply sovereignty there in order to ensure its security in advance? And do you think that Trump would agree to that?
Well, on the I always enjoy these questions. On the first one, the Russians themselves have said repeatedly that they would like to see Iranian forces leave. This goes back quite some time. In one of my visits to Moscow last year, for example, I met with President Putin. We had a discussion about that, many other things, but he was very clear that he thought it was in Russia's interest to see the Iranians leave. So it's not a question, I think, of a disagreement about the outcome, but a mutual effort to find a way to make it happen. In our view, that ought to be in the context of a general withdrawal of Iranian forces and surrogates from areas of conflict back into a nice, happy, peaceful life in Iran without nuclear weapons. Now, on the Jordan Valley, I think this has been a point that many American administrations have stressed, that Israel is entitled to live within secure frontiers. That was certainly the view of President Bush, maybe not so much in the prior administration, but that's a central objective that Prime Minister Netanyahu seeks, and it's one that we support. Now, how that works in terms of specific aspects for the West Bank generally, that will be the subject, we hope, of discussions that will follow the rollout of the peace plan. And I wouldn't want to step on the peace plan by telling you what's in it in advance, but be patient, it's coming. Yeah, sure.
IDF Radio.
Thank you. Mr. Bolton, I was wondering, can you tell us what is your end game regarding Iran? Is it a regime change, perhaps a new nuclear deal?
No, it's not regime change. It's not the policy of the United States. So go ahead. What's your next alternative?
Because you stressed in the past that you think that the United States should push for a regime change. And
Okay, stop there. Let me just address that, because it's been 6 months since I've been in Israel, so I have to do it periodically. You know, when I was a private citizen, I said and wrote many, many things. They're all out there. I still believe in them, but that's not my function here today, not to be a commentator on what I said before versus what the policies of the U.S. government are. The President sets the policies. I'm the National Security Advisor, not the National Security Decision Maker. Go ahead. I know there's a question in there. I just go ahead and ask it. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to get the clarifications out of the way before the question came. So if you do have a question, that's...
So I ask, what is your end game?
Right. Look, if Iran gave up its pursuit of nuclear weapons, its ballistic missile development program, which is designed to create delivery vehicles for nuclear weapons, if it gave up its support for terrorism, if it stopped its other malign activities across the region, we'd be very happy. Secretary Pompeo last year gave a speech where he listed 12 things. I've given you 4. It's sort of an expanded list. That's the end game we want. Okay, thank you all very much.